Okay, welcome everybody. I'm just delighted to introduce Nishad, who will be defending his dissertation today. His research uses a very new approach, which in a way could be understood as revisiting very old approach and telling the tools of maturity to make it scale. The idea that we can engineer rational perception systems whose inner workings we understand, and that actually outperform modern differential architectures. Now, I won't say much more about the science, you'll hear about this in Nishad, but I just want to invite you all to join me and also Nishad family and loved ones and the team are here, just to take a minute to celebrate them together. So I've had the pleasure of working with them since 2020. I was going back through the first emails that we exchanged, and it really struck me how much courage, perseverance, and risk-taking you've shown over that whole time. Now, it started with a pretty fiery test, which was MIT ECS accidentally rejecting him.
Yes.
And him actually, having to work with us to get in. But was undeterred, and I'm so glad we corrected our mistake. Speaking on behalf of the field. Years later, Nishad actually settled a debate that had gone on for months with a Google team we were collaborating with. A bunch of senior engineers and researchers were convinced something didn't work. And in 3 days, he made an interactive demo, which showed that it obviously worked. Disruptor from motion demo. He was one of the key organizers of the MIT Graduate Student, which is a really important feat of entrepreneurial leadership in very challenging circumstances. He's been willing to put himself in harm's way, actually, in service of his principles and convictions. I'll never forget, I referred to my program manager. Nishad can't make the meeting today anywhere on campus.
He was banned from campus.
And also the long arc of his research, I think, really shows conviction and perseverance. The architectures that he really developed over the whole PhD are ones that there's been enormous skepticism around that whole period. And yet I think he's been able to show, and I hope you'll agree, what's possible with parallel compute and some very interesting subtle engineering choices. So for all these reasons, just really delighted to have gotten to work with you and learn with you, and looking forward to many more opportunities over the years to come.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you to my committee here. I'm very excited to today be able to tell you all about a research program that I've been pursuing over the course of my PhD on scaling 3D scene perception using probabilistic programming. Understanding the 3D structure of the world is a central challenge in artificial intelligence. Our physical world is 3D, yet our AI systems often view that physical world through pixels and images. In order to build truly intelligent agents that can work in our homes, can operate alongside humans, drive our roads, they need to go beyond pixels and images and build structured 3D representations of the world around them. This is the problem of 3D scene perception. How do we take raw visual data and transform that data into meaningful and useful 3D representations? The raw visual data could come in many forms: images, depth images, point cloud data from LiDAR scanners, or video data. And the particular 3D representations we want to build often depend on the task at hand or the domain. This broad definition covers many problems in computer vision and robotics. But my own personal motivation for working on 3D scene perception is to build more general purpose robots. Robots, as we know, are constantly accumulating sensor data from their many sensors. But in order to act and operate in the world, they need to transform that data into representations that capture the structure of the environment, so they can localize and navigate, to understand the independently movable objects and recognize them so that they can interact and manipulate them. Before my PhD, I've worked on a wide variety of robotics domains. I've worked on autonomous vehicles at Uber. I've worked on personal robots in the Learning and Intelligent Systems group. And I've worked on factory automation robots at Vicarious. Across all these experiences, I saw that there are numerous challenges with bringing robots to the real world. But what stood out to me is that still today, a primary bottleneck and a primary challenge with real robots is still 3D perception. But why? To understand that, let's look at some real world data. Real world data that's challenging for today's 3D perception system. Here I'm showing you a car driving at night in the rain. It's dark out, so it's difficult to see just about anything. The rain on the windshield makes everything blurry, so it's difficult to recognize how many cars there are, how they're moving, tracking them. These are difficult conditions, but it's exactly the types of conditions we need our perception systems to generalize to if we want general purpose robots. Many communities, many research communities have been approaching this challenge of building better 3D scene perception systems. And they're approaching it with different toolkits and different perspectives. The computer graphics community builds toolkits for generating and manipulating image data. They build tools like differentiable renders, NeRFs, and more recently, 3D Gaussian splatter. They evaluate metrics like PSNR to evaluate how accurate and photorealistic their synthesized images are. When they're approaching 3D perception, it's often through the lens of analysis by synthesis, that in order to understand some image data, you need to be able to generate it. And computer graphics methods are starting to become state of the art in a lot of 3D perception tasks. For example, a recent work, 3D Gaussian splatting, is a state of the art approach to slant. But while these results are impressive, these computer graphics methods are often computationally costly and slow. And that has to do with having to need to model at photorealism, accurate models, rather than using low resolution. On the right, I'm showing you the 3D Gaussian splatting representations learned at varying numbers of Gaussians. And what we see as we reduce to fewer and fewer Gaussians, the reconstructions become more blurry and at 100 Gaussian unrecognizable. Further, their toolkits are not modeling probability, so they're not capturing uncertainty that we have over scenes, that there could be many possible scenes behind an image. The computer vision community approaches it from a different perspective, trying to learn functions to be able to predict 3D scene properties from image data. And over the last decade, we've seen how they've leveraged scaling of both data and compute to do that more accurately. They opt to learn features rather than hand engineering. And they've developed general architectures like transformers that seem to be able to be applied to many different tasks. And they've achieved state-of-the-art performance across many different computer vision applications. For example, Foundation poses a vision transformer architecture for object tracking, and it can highly accurately track objects from video data. But these architectures are costly to train, both in terms of data and compute. And they often struggle to generalize out of distribution and can exhibit unpredictable large errors. Below, I'm showing you that same video, but a low frame rate version of it, taking every 50th frame. And we can see how the tracking accuracy of Foundation pose falls off quickly. Finally, the robotics community is, of course, interested in 3D scene perception to be able to enable a real-world action selection in all the tasks they hope to accomplish. It's harder to distill simply all the wide variety of approaches we in robotics. But broadly, they're using combinations of learned and engineered representation. But because they're using different models for different parts of the pipeline, this can produce inconsistent percepts. And these systems lack globally coherent uncertainty over scenes. And this is important for robotics to act in a risk-aware and efficient way. Finally, the models struggle to generalize to the long tail of the real world. Take, for example, the Tesla self-driving cars that are driving our roads today, and the types of mistakes that these autonomous systems still make. Here's a Tesla driving straight into the back of a police car stopped on the highway. Here, the Tesla drives towards a moving train. Only at the last minute does the driver swerve out of the way, avoiding a disaster. And finally, there's an overturned truck in the middle of the lane, and the Tesla drives full speed into it. So what's behind these egregious errors? Inspecting the internal representations of these perception systems gives us some more insight. As the Tesla is driving towards this overturned truck, it's flickering between many hypotheses of what it's looking at. It's never seen an overturned truck in this way before, and it can't understand it. But instead of slowing down in the face of that uncertainty, it maintains its previous plan and crashes full speed into it. Here you're seeing a Tesla drive behind a horse-drawn buggy. And first it thinks it's a truck, then a truck driving straight at us, then person behind a truck. It's clearly confused, but we're not really sure whether it understands it's confused and can do something about it. Imagine a human that was hallucinating these types of percepts and how confused they would be and how disorienting them. There's definitely something missing in today's 3D perception systems. The title of my talk today was Scaling 3D Scene Perception Using Probabilistic Programming. So where does probability come in? Well, what we think is missing in today's architectures is probabilistic modeling of multi-resolution latent 3D world. And let me tell you why. The real world is highly variable. You're dealing with novel objects, new scenes, new lighting conditions, new weather conditions, and all of this variability is combinatorial. You can't expect to have seen every configuration before. Further, the data that we observe in the real world is always incomplete. It's noisy, it's limited resolution, there's rain on the windshield sometimes that makes everything blurry, there's occlusions, cars blocking one another. Further, the models that we build from visual data will always be approximate because it's not practical to model every detail of the visual world in full resolution. And if we want to build those models in real time, there's going to be limitations on how much compute we can use in perceptual inference. And finally, the tasks that we hope to accomplish using these models of the visual world can benefit from thinking about uncertainty, so robots can act efficiently and in a risk-aware manner. Probability theory gives us a principled framework to be able to represent and manage this variability, incompleteness, approximation, and uncertainty. And probabilistic programs give us a software framework to represent those models in code. In this thesis, I'll tell you about a probabilistic architecture for 3D perception called a generative 3D graphics program. It's based on the idea of perception as inverse graphics. Since graphics is about taking some decomposed description of a scene and producing image data, perception can be viewed as the inverse, taking image data and trying to recover that decomposed description of the scene. The probabilistic analog of that is modeling the forward process as a probabilistic generative model, and the perceptual process as Bayesian inference in that generative model. We call our architecture a generative 3D graphics program because it's based on a probabilistic generative model. Its internal representations are explicitly 3D. It models the forward image generating graphics process. And it's not just a model written down on paper, it's written down as a program in a probabilistic programming language. This idea of perception as inverse graphics is not a new one. In fact, it has a long history in psychology, cognitive science, and computer science, tracing back to the 90s with ideas like the generic viewpoint from Bill Freeman, or vision as Bayesian inverse graphics from Alan Ewell. And over the years, we've seen implementations of perception systems using this inverse graphics formulation in probabilistic programs, but also in neural networks as well. And more broadly, the idea of probabilistic modeling and inference in computer vision also has a long history. Ideas like loopy belief propagation, graphical models for object recognition and image segmentation, and hierarchical graphical models as well. But when I started my PhD, it really hadn't been shown yet whether these methods could work on real-world data and computer vision and robotics benchmarks, whether it could be made practical to use in the real world on real robots, and whether it could scale to the open world for real-time 3D perception. In my talk today, I'll walk you through a series of works during my PhD that each took an important step towards more general purpose 3D perception. Our first work, 3DP3, shows that generative 3D graphics programs can actually work on real-world benchmarks. 3DP3 infers 3D scene graphs from real-world images and corrects common sense errors from deep learning. But 3DP3 was still too slow to use in practice. Bayes3D scales up these ideas using GPU-accelerated probabilistic inference so that they could be deployed on real robots. By the end of this talk, I will have shown you generative 3D graphics programs that can build multi-resolution probabilistic models of 3D matter, track 3D scenes in real time, compete with vision transformers and 3D Gaussian splatting, and be applied in the open world. Today, we'll start with 3DP3. 3DP3 infers a latent 3D scene and a 3D scene graph representing contact relationships between objects from image data. We apply it to the task of object pose estimation, which is the task of given images, how do we identify what objects are present in those images and what are their poses, their 3D position and orientation. The go-to method in the literature on this problem is using deep neural networks that are trained to take in images and regress out the presence and pose of these objects. The state-of-the-art method at the time was called dense fusion. But even when being trained on large amounts of data, dense fusion still makes common sense errors like the ones shown here. On the left, an object is predicted to be floating in midair above the table, interpenetrating two other objects. In the second one, it's interpenetrating the table's surface. The third one, the bowl is predicted to be occupying a region of space where there's clearly no object. 3DP3 was able to correct these common sense errors. So how did we do this? Well, 3DP3 is a generative model. It's a probability distribution over a latent 3D scene and an observed image. That distribution factors into prior on the latent 3D scene multiplied by a likelihood of the observed image data given the 3D scene. The prior on the latent 3D scene is meant to capture common sense knowledge that we have about the world, and the likelihood of the observed image is meant to capture how consistent some image data is with a 3D scene explanation. I'll start by describing this prior on latent 3D scene. 3DP3 represents scenes compositionally in terms of objects. But objects aren't represented using highly accurate photorealistic models of shape and texture, instead using coarse, voxelized models of their 3D shape. A voxel model is essentially a 3D binary array corresponding to a region of 3D space divided up into cells. If a cell is assigned a value 1, it's occupied. 0 indicates it's free. And above, you're seeing 6 different voxel shape models. They're not very precise, but you can recognize some of these objects from their coarse models. 3DP3 represents distributions on these 3D binary arrays to capture uncertainty that we have about an object's shape. And these distributions are learned from data, but not from a large corpus of training data labeled examples. Instead, just from 5 images. From these 5 images, using a multi-view reconstruction, we can update the posterior over this voxel grid. On the right, you're seeing what that voxel grid looks like, where because we've gotten many views looking outside of the mug, we're fairly certain about its outside structure. But since we have never gotten a perspective looking inside of the mug, we don't know whether it's hollow or full, and the voxel distribution captures that uncertainty over the inner box. Scenes are defined compositionally in terms of those objects. One way to define a scene would be by defining the absolute position and orientation of each of the objects in that world. That would be a fair representation, but fails to capture a lot of the underlying dependencies that exist between these objects. For example, if I bumped the table here, many of the objects would move in a correlated way. A more faithful description of that underlying dependency would be using a graph, a 3D scene graph, in which edges represent contact relationships between objects. For this image, there's 5 objects sitting in contact with the table's surface, and the red mug sitting in contact with the yellow sugar box. Alongside this graph, there's also contact parameters of the graph that are implicitly defining a relative pose between an object and its parent. These are contact parameters like what face of the can is in contact with what face of the table. What is the point of contact? How is the object rotated about the normal? And if there's any deviation from perfectly flush contact, how long is it? We put priors over the graph structure, broad and uninformative priors that just say that the graph has to be a tree structured graph. And priors over the contact parameters that simply encourage the contact to be approximately flush, but allowing for some deviation. Putting these pieces together, we have a scene graph with scene graph parameters. And if we traverse the edges of this graph and accumulate the relative poses, we can recover absolute poses for each of the objects. And then place the voxel models at those poses, defining a full latent scene. Now this is a distribution. We can sample from and produce sampled latent 3D scenes. Here I'm showing you 4 such samples, and You see the variations in graph structures. You see different objects and different configurations and contacts. But overall, these look like physically plausible scenes, realistic scenes we might expect to see. If we compare that now to if we'd used a prior that didn't use graphs or model dependencies and just sampled poses of objects independently, you get samples like the one shown here, where you're getting random jumbles of objects. So that's the latent 3D scene in a prior. Now we'll describe how that connects to image data, how we calculate the likelihood of observed image data. So this involves computing the probability of an observed image X given a latent 3D scene hypothesis, Z. The way this is calculated is by rendering the 3D scene out into a depth image using a rendering engine, and transforming the rendered and observed depth images into 3D point clouds. Then we take the rendered 3D point cloud and place spheres of radius r at each rendered point, and define a distribution that's a mixture over all of these spheres. And then the observed point cloud is sampled from this mixture of spheres distribution. To calculate this probability of this observed 3D point cloud being drawn from this mixture of spheres distribution could involve calculating this n by m distance matrix. N points in the rendered 3D point cloud, m points in the observed 3D point cloud, and all pairwise distances. But because we have defined our likelihood in this way, spheres of radius r with the probability mass falling to 0 outside of it, instead what we have to just calculate is for an observed point shown in black, which rendered points is it within radius r of, meaning it's within their spheres. And to do this, we can use spatial data structures like KD trees, which can accelerate the calculation of this within distance r matrix. And that's what makes calculating this likelihood practical on real data. This radius r is an important hyperparameter of the model. At small values of r, we're essentially expecting the observed image to match the rendered data exactly, which will rarely be true in practice. With larger values of r, we can tolerate more error between the observed depth image and the render. And this is an important idea that will come back later. So we have a prior on the 3D scene and a likelihood of the image data. All of this is written down as a full generative model captured as a probabilistic program. The probabilistic program first samples shapes from the shape distributions, then a scene graph from the scene graph prior, then contact parameters conditioned on that scene graph, and all of that together is rendered out into a depth image. Then, conditioned on that noiseless depth image, a noisy observed depth image is sampled. So this probabilistic program models this forward graphics process of generating an image. But in practice, when we want to use this system, we're only given an image. And our goal is to infer a posterior over possible 3D scenes that could explain it. This inference boils down to inferring this scene graph and also the scene graph parameters. For inference of the scene graph, we use a technique called involutive MCMC, which allows us to propose edits to the structure of this graph, which is actually changing the structure of the generative model. And for inference of the scene graph parameters, we use a collection of custom Metropolis Hastings moves that use techniques like ICP for aligning a mesh to some point cloud data, but also Gaussian drift moves that just propose small perturbations. Here I'm showing you that process play out, where the Metropolis Hastings moves are moving the object poses to become more consistent with the image data. You can see how these clamps are being rotated to be consistent with what's seen. Then the scene graph edges are being added by the involutive moves as contact relations are inferred. That further informs some of these scene graph or object pose moves. And eventually this process converges. As I showed you, this model and inference algorithm can correct many of the common sense failures of deep learned systems. And evaluating quantitatively on the YCV video dataset, a widely used benchmark for evaluating pose estimation in robotics, we find that 3DP3 can improve over dense fusion, the neural method used alone. 3DP3 was a proof of concept of this idea, that it could work on real-world data. But it was still too slow to use in practice. Base 3D scales up these ideas using GPU-accelerated probabilistic inference, so that they could be deployed on real robots. Base 3D moves away from the slow sequential MCMC from 3D-P3 that I just showed you in that movie, towards more fast, parallel sequential Monte Carlo. We use an algorithm called course-defined sequential Monte Carlo. And how this works is we take a random variable of interest, and for simplicity, we'll show it as a 2D random variable in this gray region. We partition the space and sample representative points of this random variable in each of these grids. Then we score these under the generative model to assign weights to each of these cells. And then we can sample from these cells according to the weights. Then we can repeat this process using a finer grid, finer partition centered at that point over a tighter region of space. Sample representative points, score under the generative model to assign these weights, and then sample again. And we could repeat this process to get more accurate estimates and repeat it with each iteration, getting finer and finer. This algorithm is called course defined because it started out with coarse gridding over this random variable, and at each step went to finer and finer regions. This C to F SMC algorithm can be GPU accelerated. And to do that, hinged on three key technical ideas. The first was implementing the scene graph probabilistic program that I showed you in 3D-P3 on the GPU, so that we could generate scene graphs and score them on the GPU in parallel. That step of the C to F algorithm where we're sampling representative points, scoring them, can happen entirely in parallel to assign weights to each of the cells. This was enabled by research done by McCoy Becker on GenJAX, which is a GPU-compatible version of probabilistic program. But having the probabilistic program run on the GPU is only useful if all of the components of it can run on the GPU and run in parallel as well. As we showed you, the scene graph probabilistic program relies on rendering engines and image likeness. So we also developed versions of rendering engines that could render many hypothesized poses of an object into rendered depth images in parallel. It could render over 30,000 scenes. And also variants of the point cloud likelihood, the sphere point cloud likelihood, that were written down using convolutional operations so that they could be parallel over pixels. That means you could take many rendered depth images and score them against some observed depth data in parallel. Our likelihood could evaluate over 100,000 per second. What this unlocked is applying C to F SMC to infer an object's pose. And here I'm showing you that process play out, where we're gridding over thousands of poses of an object on a table surface, scoring them in parallel, sampling, and repeating with a tighter and tighter grid, both in translation and in orientation. This visualization here is serialized for visualization purposes and over 10,000x slowed down. Because actually in practice, all of the grading, all the scoring is happening in parallel, and it's only a few sequential steps. Here you're seeing the last stage of that sequential step, where after many stages, we can now have an accurate estimate of this object. What this unlocked is tapping into probabilistic querying that was possible in 3D-P3, but not yet practical to use. With base 3D in a matter of milliseconds, we could characterize a posterior distribution over an object's pose. On the left, there's an image of a bowl, and below it, the corresponding posterior samples, and they're distributed along this ring. And this is because the bowl is a rotationally symmetric object, so would be indistinguishable in many different orientations. In the middle, an image of a mug with a handle visible. Seeing the handle removes any ambiguity we have about this object's orientation. And as a result, the posterior samples are concentrated about a single point there. But on the right, we see the mug again. However, in this case, the handle is occluded. The resulting posterior samples are along this arc of orientation. And this would be all of the orientations in which that handle would continue to be. We also use this C to F SMC algorithm for few-shot learning of novel objects and scene parsing. So capturing a video of a novel object on my phone, we could build a mesh out of that and add that to a growing library of learned object meshes. Then, given some input image containing those objects, we could use the C to F SMC algorithm to identify and localize these objects one by one. First, the blue pitcher, then the red mug, and finally, the toy airplane. We deployed this on real robots, introducing it a new toy airplane object it's never seen before. The robot pans around it, capturing views from 10 different perspectives, then fuses that into a point cloud and builds a 3D mesh out of it. Then immediately that model can be used for pose estimation and grasping. Here you can see as I'm placing it down in different configurations in front of the robot, it's still accurately grasping it at this same point on the wing. Interestingly, Base 3D can generalize to configurations of this object quite different than what it saw at training. At training, it only saw it in 10 views sitting flat on the table surface. Here we've propped it up on its tail wing, and it's able to still estimate its pose accurately and understand the new contact relationship. Base 3D is also being used by researchers studying planning and decision-making under uncertainty. Here, the robot is tasked with searching for a banana. But from its current perspective, the banana is occluded. It's out of view. There's many occluded regions of the scene, behind the mug, behind the pink book, behind the apple. But Base 3D can identify that the only possible place it could be is behind the pink book. Since if it was behind the mug or the apple, it wouldn't be fully occluded and we'd be able to see it. That can guide the robot to take the right information gathering action to look behind the pink book, where it does find the banana, recognize it, and grasps it. This was work done with Aidan Curtis and George Matthias. It's also being used by cognitive science researchers that are studying human perceptual inferences. Here's a VR study in which a participant is tasked with the same thing as the robot, searching for the banana amongst a bunch of occluding objects. The inferences made by humans about the object they choose to move out of the way was compared to computational models like Base 3D. This was work done in collaboration with Ari and Zaruf. We also extended Base 3D to incorporate color into the voxel shape models. And this expanded the generality of this. We can now apply it to data just captured from my iPhone. So here's some input video of a background, camera moving around, and then I'm introducing the spray bottle. From just a single frame of these videos, we can construct these voxel meshes. From the background, we can make a background mesh. When the object's introduced, we can make an object mesh. You can see that they're coarse and have some colors, but they're not photorealistic. They're quite coarse and approximate. We can then use this online learning of these meshes to infer a latent 3D scene and track the camera pose and object pose over time. So at first, we're just tracking the background and the camera pose. Then the object gets introduced, it pops into the latent representation, and its pose is inferred even as my hand moves around. We've also applied this in the multi-object set. On the left is the input video from my phone. In the center is an inferred latent 3D scene that's being built up over time and tracked. And on the right, an outlier mask that shows which parts of the input video are not well explained by the inferred latency. So at first, when the first ramen can is introduced, it's outliers until a mesh pops in and is tracked. Then the second mesh pops in, and finally, the spray bottle. These ideas from 3D-P3 and Base 3D made important progress, showing that these generative 3D graphics programs could be applied to real-world data. In the last section of my talk today, I'll tell you about Gen 3D. Gen 3D builds multi-resolution probabilistic models of 3D matter, tracks 3D scenes in real time, is competitive with vision transformers and 3D Gaussian splatting, and can be applied to open world conception. Gen 3D uses a flexible representation of 3D matter based on Gaussians. It moves away from using rendering engines and fixed meshes, as was done in the pilot work. This flexible representation allows us to interpolate between using fine-grained, accurate, almost photorealistic models of objects, but also back away from it and use coarse-grained models that can just use a few Gaussians to coarsely model an object shape. This allows Gen 3D to run very fast at over 50 FPS and allows Gen 3D to use online inference and not require any offline training. Finally, Gen 3D is a general purpose architecture and can be applied for object tracking, camera tracking, deformable object modeling, and we expect many more. At its core, Gen 3D uses Gaussians to model 3D maps. They are 6-dimensional Gaussians because they're modeling the 3 spatial dimensions and 3 color dimensions. They're parameterized by a mean in 3D and a covariance, a spatial covariance defined by a quaternion and 3 scale parameters. In color, they have a mean color and also per channel color variances to represent the color variability for the region of 3D matter modeled by this Gaussian. That's how one Gaussian is defined, but a Gen 3D model consists of many Gaussians. Gen 3D uses collections of these Gaussians to model observed point cloud data coming from an image. But it's also a hierarchical model, which is modeling at the level of a scene, which groups these Gaussians into independently movable objects and also models a pose of a camera, a reference frame that's observing this 3D matter. Gen 3D is also a temporal model because it models the dynamics of how the scene might change over time. The poses of the objects could move over time, the pose of the camera can also move, and how that influences the motion of the Gaussians, since Gaussians in a shared reference frame will move in a similar way. It also allows for Gaussians within a single object reference frame to move within that reference frame as well. We designed Gen 3D this way because we want to apply it to video data, where there's a moving camera, moving objects, multiple objects even, and also scenes with deforming matter, like a piece of paper. Gen 3D models images using these Gaussian, using a Gaussian mixture model that scores the probability of an observed point cloud given a Gen 3D model consisting of many Gaussians. Gen 3D is an explicitly probabilistic model, the GMM. It uses Gaussians as the mixture components, and point clouds are sampled from these Gaussians. I want to contrast that early on with another method that uses Gaussians in a similar way, called 3D Gaussian splatting. But the difference here is that 3D Gaussian splatting is a deterministic rendering. It also uses Gaussians, but the Gaussians are used as splatting proofs, and pixel colors are blended from those Gaussians. So if you have a pixel in an image and you cast a ray out in the scene, Gaussian splatting uses each of these Gaussians and computes their influence on that ray's color in sequence. So first the blue one, then the red one, and so on. Where you see the difference concretely is when we look at what the learned representations look like at varying numbers of Gaussians. At high numbers of Gaussians, which is what Gaussian splatting was designed for, tens of thousands, even millions of Gaussians in practice, their reconstructions look quite accurate, and so do Gen 3D. But as we go to fewer and fewer Gaussians, we could see how the reconstructions from Gaussian splatting become blurry, and at 100 Gaussians, unrecognizable. Gen 3D, on the other hand, becomes coarser and more approximate, but still is able to model key elements of the scene. I'll come back to the quantitative implications of this later. So in this Gen 3D image likelihood, we're calculating this likelihood under a Gaussian mixture model. So the left here is a log probability of some image data given k Gaussians of the Gen 3D model. The sum here is showing that the pixels are all independent. But for each pixel, we need to calculate the probability under this k Gaussian mixture model. Now, as you can see from the 3 sums in this likelihood, calculating this requires thinking about height by width by k pixel Gaussian interactions. All the height by width pixels in the image and the k Gaussians. In practice, this can be expensive to compute, for large or high resolution images or Gen 3D models with many Gaussians. In practice, we use an approximation to make this possible to use. What we do is, for each Gaussian in the Gen 3D model, we project it to the image plane. We find which pixel the mean of that Gaussian collides with. But instead of calculating that Gaussian's influence on all the pixels in the image, we instead limit to this window of pixels around it and only calculate its influence on those pixels. The assumption here is that for further away pixels, those points will be further away in 3D space, and the influence of that Gaussian will be minimal. So we take that Gaussian, this window of pixels, calculate that Gaussian's influence, and update that in this array in which we store the log likelihoods. Then we go back to the Gen 3D model, get the next Gaussian, find its collision point, take the window of pixels, score them, and update the log likelihood. And we do this for all of the Gaussians in the Gen 3 model. And for visualization purposes, I'm showing you this running serially, where as each Gaussian is processed and its window is scored, that's updated in this array of log likelihood. But in practice, this is implemented as a fast CUDA current. And in parallel, across all Gaussians, we're calculating each of their influences on their corresponding window of pixels and updating their values in this pixel log likelihood array atomically. And it needs to be done using atomic operations because many Gaussians might be influencing the same pixel and writing to the same value in that array. With these ideas, we could scale up inference past the ideas I've shown you thus far. In 3DP3, we used serial scoring per frame, involutive MCMC moves for the scene graph, and custom proposals for object poses. In Base 3D, we used parallel scoring and enumerative scoring. But in Gen 3D, we're using parallel scoring per Gaussian, and we can use parallel block expectation maximization moves per frame. We can use parallel block Gibbs moves per frame, and also tap into gradient updates for camera and object. What this unlocks is the ability to take some input point cloud, segmentation mask, build a Gen 3D Gaussian model of the background and the object and represent a full scene, and then track that scene in real time. So here, as my hand goes in and picks up the object in the Gen 3D model also moves. And as I slide it across the table, we compared this capability to the state-of-the-art methods in computer vision. We compared with the foundation pose vision transformer, which is the state-of-the-art method for object pose training. Foundation pose, however, requires over 600 plus hours of training. It's specialized to the object pose tracking task, and it struggles to generalize to out-of-distribution data, as I'll show you. Gen 3D, on the other hand, requires no training. It can be applied to many tasks and is able to generalize to different data. We use it for object tracking by taking the first frame of the video, a mask of the object in that first frame, and fitting a Gen 3D Gaussian model to that portion of the data. Then, given input video, the subsequent frames, visualized here on the left as a point cloud, we can track the pose of that Gen 3D model over time. On the right, I'm showing you the overlay of that model on the input video. This shows that we're actually tracking the pose of that object active and staying consistent with what we see in the input video. We evaluated on a short horizon version of the YCD video dataset, just taking the first 400 frames of each video. We limit it to this short horizon evaluation because the model that's fit by Gen 3D is just from the first frame, so it's quite partial. So in later segments of the video, we're seeing maybe an entirely new part. When we evaluated on this version of the dataset, we found that Gen 3D can track more accurately than foundation pose while being faster as well. But the results get more interesting when we push foundation pose out of its original training distribution. Here, it's running on the original frame rate data, and the tracking looks quite good. But when we take it into the low frame rate regime, where we're skipping and taking only every 50th frame, the tracking results degrade significantly. On this variant of the dataset, we found Gen 3D even more significantly outperforming foundation pose in tracking accuracy. On the right, I'm showing you scatter plots of the same data that's shown in the table on the left. But on the right, on the x-axis, are the foundation pose accuracy, and on the y-axis are the Gen 3D accuracy. And each point is a different object. What we find is, generally, Gen 3D is able to pretty substantially improve tracking accuracy over foundation. Here's a visualization of that tracking over time, where foundation pose loses track of this T-zip box object quite early and never regains track, whereas Gen 3D can maintain consistent track over the course of the long video. This highlights how Gen 3D is able to go beyond just differentiable programming approaches that are doing local optimization and can tap into inference moves involving enumeration, EM, and Gibbs. We also compared with state-of-the-art methods in computer graphics. Methods like 3D Gaussian splatting. 3D Gaussian splatting is the state-of-the-art method for novel view synthesis, and also is now applied to 3D perception in the state-of-the-art in SLAM as well. It's designed for photorealistic reconstruction, which means it's slow. On object tracking and camera tracking, it's running at about 1 to 5 FPS. And it also struggles at low resolution. Gen3D, on the other hand, can use coarse approximate models. And instead of trying to reconstruct images, it's trying to score them probabilistically. I showed you this earlier, but again, what we find is when Gaussian splatting is pushed into the low Gaussian regime, its reconstructions become blurred and then uninterpreted. Gen3D, on the other hand, can smoothly coursing and still represent the same, at least in a coarse approximate way. The quantitative implications of this are important. On the left, I'm showing you a graph in which we're showing the tracking accuracy as we change the number of Gaussians. At high numbers of Gaussians, shown here, both Gen3D and Gaussian splatting can track quite highly accurate. But as we reduce the number of Gaussians that the model has access to, Gaussian splatting's tracking error increases steeply. At about 50 Gaussians and 10 Gaussians, the tracking error is just too high for it to be used in practice. Gen3D, on the other hand, as you reduce the number of Gaussians, does increasing tracking error. But even only using 10 Gaussians to model an object is outperforming foundation pose, the vision transform, in track accuracy. This becomes practically useful when we look at the graph on the right, the speed of these approaches as we change the number of Gaussians. As we reduce the number of Gaussians, even down to 100 Gaussians for Gen3D, it can run at over 200 FPS, which is extremely fast compared to Gaussian splatting and vision. We wanted to highlight this capability on the task of SLAM. In the SLAM task, you're given input video and depth data. So you're also seeing the point cloud representation of that input video. And the objective is to track the camera's pose over the course of the video. With Gen3D, we build one of these coarse approximate models of the scene and track the camera pose relative to the model. Zooming in on that one step, you could see how coarse and approximate that model actually is. It's actually very difficult to even recognize most parts of this scene. Compare that now to the Gaussian splatting, which is also doing camera pose tracking. But as it's doing it, it's also building up this photorealistic, highly accurate map of the environment, which can be kind of good. The quantitative implications of this, when we evaluated on the replica dataset, a synthetic dataset that's commonly used for evaluating SLAM approaches, we found that Gen3D can improve the accuracy over splat, the previous state of the art, and also be much faster. Gen3D yields a 75% reduction in error, while at the same time being 20 times faster compared to splat. This result really highlights how coarse and approximate probabilistic models can both be faster, but also more accurate. Lastly, I want to show you some exciting recent results. This flexible Gaussian representation can go beyond just tracking of rigid objects and tracking camera pose in a static environment. Here, I'm showing you the Gen3D model being used to track the deformable matter as a piece of paper is being torn. The Gaussians are deforming as the paper moves and deforms, and as it's being torn in half, it splits, and some Gaussians go to the left half and some to the right half. On the bottom, you're seeing it applied to open world scenes and dynamic scenes like the one here, where George is moving a book closer to the camera and further away. And you can see as it comes closer to the camera, we're adding more and more Gaussians. But as we pull it away, Gaussians are pulled in, it's represented with few Gaussians, showing how this Gen3D model can allocate capacity of these Gaussians and dynamically change them over the course of this dynamic scene. We're very excited about the next steps that we're going to take with this model, adding deeper causal representations to our representations of scenes by modeling physics and agents, and also looking forward to deploying Gen3D on robots in the wild. I'm also very excited to share that after my PhD, I'll be co-founding a company with Vikash and George to build out and scale this technology in a narrow application domain. so that we can bring these ideas to real-world application. To close today, I want to summarize what I've told you about so far. I've introduced the idea of generative 3D graphics programs, which are probabilistic generative models over latent 3D scenes and observed images. They can infer 3D scene graphs from real-world images and correct common sense errors from deep learning. They can be scaled up using modern hardware like GPUs to get accelerated probabilistic inference so that they can be deployed on real robots. And finally, they can model 3D matter at a multi-resolution level, track 3D scenes in real time. They can be competitive with vision transformers and 3D Gaussian spotting and be applied in the open world. I want to leave you with some final thoughts here. And if you forget everything I've said in my talk so far and only leave here remembering 3 things, I hope it will be these 3 ideas. First, data is not a silver bullet. A common view in AI is that hand engineering is hopeless, and scaling up data and compute is the solution. But models learn from enormous amounts of data still make common sense errors, like the one mentioned. And when deployed in the real world, they can produce dangerous behavior like Tesla self-driving car. I've shown you in this talk 3 systems for 3D scene perception based on generative 3D graphics programs. They required no large-scale training or no offline training, yet they could outperform some of these learned systems on real tasks and benchmarks. Second, probability is not just about uncertainty. Yes, probability is important to deal with uncertainty in data, like ambiguity about the pose of an object. And we need that for robots to work safely and efficiently, and also for autonomous vehicles to understand that they are uncertain. But our view on probability goes beyond that. We also need probability so our models can be coarse and approximate, because these coarse and approximate models can achieve better trade-offs between accuracy and speed, and can deal with the variability of the real world. Finally, I've shown you efficient, interpretable generative AI. Generative AI is all the hype today. Models like Gemini and ChatGPT, they show amazing results and we use them almost every day. But these models are black boxes, so when they make mistakes, it can be difficult to understand why and to debug them. They're also expensive to train, data hungry, and energy used. We propose a new type of generative AI that is lightweight. It uses interpretable, structured geometric representation and can be modularly extended and debugged. I'll conclude by thanking all of the people that made this work possible. First, my committee. Thank you to Bill for your guidance in this final phase of my PhD and showing me how to communicate these ideas to the field of computer vision. Thank you, Leslie, for giving me that summer computer vision project where I struggled to train a neural network, eventually gave up and decided I wanted to build something. Thank you to Josh and Vikash, my advisors, for your support and mentorship, and for creating a unique environment to work on a hard problem for a long period of time. And thank you for letting me craft my PhD in a way that aligned with my future goals. Thank you to all my collaborators, lab mates, friends, colleagues. This work would not have been possible without you. I am very excited to be able to continue to collaborate with you for many years to come. Thank you to Dilip George and Miguel Lazaro-Guidia from Vicarious and DeepMind for introducing me to the ideas of probabilistic generative models, for giving me the freedom to explore these ideas and to build my confidence as a young researcher. Of course, I can't leave out the Graduate Student Union. When I came to MIT, there was no union here. And during my PhD, I've gotten a chance to be a part of organizing when our union was underground, to winning a union election, to sitting across from MIT at the bargaining table, to winning a contract, and then serving as an executive. I never expected that this would be a part of my PhD journey, but it has been a core part of it and a transformative. So thank you to all of you and a lifetime of friendship. Thanks to all my family and friends who made this PhD journey so much more enjoyable. I'm very excited that I get to stay in Cambridge so that the end of my PhD doesn't mean leaving all of you. Thank you to my partner, Shivali, for being truly my partner in this PhD. I met Shivali about halfway through my PhD, and she's been my best friend in this process. She's heard this thesis presentation probably 100 times. In fact, she could probably come up here and give it to all of you. So I'm sure she's very happy I'm done with this. I'm excited for many more adventures and a future together. Thank you to my sister. I got to live with my sister for a year during my PhD, which was an extraordinary time. I hope we get to live in the same city again soon. Mansi is in medical school, and I am quite relieved that she'll be the real doctor, and I'll be the the other way around would have been truly a problem. And finally, to my parents, without whom none of this work would have been possible. My mom has always kept me grounded and taught me that it's about the journey rather than the end result. And my dad is the reason I came to grad school, to learn how to learn and learn how to think. I wanted to share something my dad sent me during the last few weeks. I told him that my thesis was 140 pages long. It said 140 pages divided by 5 years of work. Comes out to 0.076 pages per day. And that really put it into perspective for me. Because research is a marathon. It's not about a single good idea or a single breakthrough. It's about a persistent and committed effort over a long period of time with the support of a whole network of people around you. So I'll end by saying thank you to all of you for being part of my PhD journey. And I'll open the floor for questions.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question about pose estimation in the phase 3D. If you could go back to the slide that showed the bowl and the two different mug poses in the middle section. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, in the middle one, it makes sense that there's this unique orientation that we care about. And in the right one, to the extent we care about picking it up by the handle, it makes sense that we have this one-dimensional uncertainty. But in the left side, you can imagine if we don't care about the texture or color, but just about the shape, rather than saying we have this uniform prior, in any case, uncertainty about how it's rotated, you might just want to mod out by that and say we actually know everything that's informative about it. Have you looked at situations where you can mod out by symmetries that you don't care about?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We thought about trying to learn those symmetries from the voxel models by, for example, testing for rotational symmetry or symmetry through a certain plane. We explored that, but we haven't used that in any of these diploid systems. Thanks for the question. Alex?
Really, really great talk, Nishad. So in the first two sections that you talked about, I think one of the capabilities that came through was that you could reason about occlusion, you could reason about objects that you had only seen from a couple different viewpoints, and you use that to do things like pick up the toy plane when it was in a new location or know where to look for the banana. Have you thought about how you're going to get those capabilities in the world where you're using Gaussian splatting or sort of Gaussian representation?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. The Gen 3D models are currently only modeling visible surfaces, but we see extensions of it where you could actually use Gaussian splatting style rendering models where you're aware of which Gaussians each ray passes through. So that would require a modification to how we're doing this. But we do see analogs of the Gaussian splatting type rendering model, but probabilistic where you would, instead of going through the ray and accumulating these color influences, you could just think about, say, the Gaussians projected onto this line in 2D and think about it as just a mixture along that ray. So we've explored this.
It's very impressive work, and I had a question about, so I'm not very much in the field, but I've seen some new models that have been trained on a ton of data. I know that data isn't a silver bullet, but I've been impressed that you can shift the camera angle and the model can kind of come up with what would expect. You can take that Titanic scene, shift it, and it knows the ocean's probably below the boat. And I'm wondering if there's any way to combine that sort of world knowledge with the models you've built, because there's the occlusion. Once you can't see it, you don't know what it is, but you could guess that maybe if this side's a bookshelf and that side's a bookshelf, in between is also a bookshelf, something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. The models in their current form are capable of hypothesizing those completions, but one sort of example is that if you have priors on the shapes of these objects, like we did in 3D-P3, those learned shape priors, you could do completions of that sort. And some of like Arian's research is looking into exactly. Aldo?
Amazing work, by the way. And yeah, very impressed, man. And wanted to, I've always kind of represented the neural network side of the story. And I want to know if you have considered like algorithms like wake sleep like or dream coder like, in which you learn as you use this to specialize better and maybe improve your performance over time by amortizing the, the like, let's say the expensive way in which you do things into a neural network. Have you explored those things, considered them, or maybe they just are not compatible? Yeah.
I haven't explored those in detail, but some of the ways in which we use neural networks in this research are neural networks for like extracting features and using object models that have like neural features attached to them as well, but not too much. Daniel?
There was a slide where you were talking about how you apply prior to the angle of contact, I believe. And I was just curious, is that just applied on like one contact, one voxel to one voxel, or are you kind of taking an envelope of the object's shape and looking at multiple voxels in their like average angle? Because I
Great
imagine with
question.
irregular shapes, it becomes
Yeah,
weird.
great question. So the way that works is for each of the objects, we use a coarse approximation to say that it's like bounding box, it's 3D bounding box. The 6 faces of that bounding box are its contact planes. So when like a table surface with this contact plane is in contact with an object like this, you're modeling it by like saying, what's the point of contact on the table surface? How is it rotated? And if there's deviation from a flush contact, it's like, what is like the angle of the deviation? How far is it pulled apart?
So this is like a separate idea than looking at individual voxels. This is
Yes,
like,
this is an aggregate over a collection of voxels defined.
How do you deal with different lighting conditions? I noticed your Gaussian has mean RGB values, right? So is potential extension like some sort of hierarchical model for lighting conditions to estimate reflectances or?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to go to one of these videos. In fact, in these tracking results here with Gen 3D, where we're learning a model and then tracking its flows over time. Actually, you can see from this video, once it goes back to the beginning, that actually the lighting changes quite a bit over the course of the video. So if you're just modeling color alone and thinking about it as static or RGB value, then by the end of it, it looks entirely different. And actually, for a long time, we were struggling with like maintaining tracks over longer periods because of that. And what we saw is like adding flex to the model where you can actually be doing inference over this color variable, having a dynamics model of it saying that it changes slowly over time, lets it maintain more accurate. So we haven't gotten to the level of like modeling more causally, just like lighting and how it affects color, but just adding this like little bit of flex to the model that says it could change from frame to frame, but it doesn't change drastically. Introduces like another layer.
A really quick question about the 100 Gaussian splatting case. Do you see that as a failure of the Gaussian splatting model or of the inference algorithm? You know, are the Gaussians that you find really bad under the Gaussian splatting loss function, or is it just that it can't find and they just can't find them?
Yeah.
Or is the loss function making it spread out and that's actually an optimal?
I think it's a combination of things. There's the inference algorithm. It's possible that these reconstructions could look better if we had an inference algorithm that could like better split these big Gaussians that seem to blur the whole screen. So that's part of it. But even if like an ideal coarse Gaussian splatting model, just because of the rendering model, wouldn't be producing depth data in a way that looks like coherent. For example, if you take one Gaussian and render it through the Gaussian splatting model, what it looks like is like a flat region of depth, and then it falls back very quick. And that type of representation can model depth very well when you have like many of them, and you can kind of like piece them together like this and cover all the parts. But if you don't have Gaussian to cover most of the view cone, then you get these like long tails that fire back in the depth reconstructions. But I think that could be fixed by a rendering model that like treats those Gaussians as, because you could actually have it project onto this ray and understand that like it's unlikely that it'll hit the far plane.
Just a conceptual question. So So when I think about sort of deep learning vision, I contrast it with this. One way to look at that comparison is to think of the inference time compute graphs. What's going on in inference time? How's information flowing through the pipeline? So one difference I see is that the compute graph here is derived from inference to model, whereas in the transformers it's learned from data. But I'm wondering if you can talk anything about any other qualitative similarities or differences. Because, when I see these movies even that, and it's striking that there's lots of local convolution and sort of spatial windows that show up in the likelihood approximations and the sampling algorithms. I'm wondering if maybe the compute graphs are more similar, I expect, what you see in some modular deep learning architectures, albeit with some differences. Yeah.
I mean, when you look at a video like this, the compute graphs for something like this look very similar to what you would see in a CNN. But I think what's different is that it's adaptive in that, like when Gaussians move around the screen, their convolutional filters also move to those regions. When you use less Gaussians to model something, there's less of those convolution. And that adaptiveness, rather than like a fixed circuit, is I think what delivers this new speed accuracy trade-off that we're counting.
Yeah, I'm curious how you initialize the Gaussians in the Gen 3D model, because I could see how you did that in base 3D, where you sort of like do this gridding so you can, localize where the object model is. But like now you have tons of Gaussians and you have to like put them in their initial grid locations fairly quickly, I assume. So how do you do that?
Well, actually, the Gibbs and EM moves great really.
And how do you do that without any bottom-up features? I guess is the sort of what feels a bit magical.
Well, running these parallel block EM and Gibbs moves, you could start from an initialization that looks like this, and very quickly in like 3 or 4 of those parallel steps across all of these parts of this, like converge to a reconstruction of this. Other types of initializations are simple ones where you just unproject the initial frame, subsample some points, and start out some values there. Either of these initializations, actually, with just a few of these inference moves, can converge to fairly good reconstruction.
Question. So the Gaussian splatting and the probabilistic method you described here, can you think of it being applicable beyond imaging?
I haven't thought about that. Let's exchange numbers.
In your loss function with the Gaussian mixture model, I mean, is there any like explicit sparsity imposed in that? And then is that really what makes it different than Gaussian splatting, in which like sparsity is not necessary and therefore not introduced, or is it?
The sparsity comes from like the choice of which of these terms to ignore computing with the assumption that they're small. So like the assumption that something far away will be further, will be lower weight is the choice of how to throw these terms.
So I have many, first of all, this is one of the best talks I've seen in a long time. This is fantastic. And I have many questions, which I'll ask you in the closed session, but maybe I'll just ask you one more question for the open session, because I think these are important things to talk about openly, which is, what are the biggest things missing from your system, or where are the biggest things that don't work yet?
I think one of the struggles here is like in systems like base 3D, when we're trying to like localize poses of objects, we're still using like really brute force types of approaches to do that. Gridding over every pose on the paper. And that comes from like not having any bottom up processing or features or detecting some regions and being able to like initialize this inference correctly. I think that can cut off a lot of speed or like improve the speed of this algorithm significantly. But I think that's research that's been pursued by a lot of other people on the KaiSite team about how to like.
But like in Gen 3D, what you just showed us was actually you can do just sort of pure
top-down probabilistic inference extremely fast, right? So I was actually more focused on Gen 3D. Like, it does amazing things, but like where are its weak points right now, or points where it needs further development?
Yeah. I think the weak points are, we haven't yet shown like the probabilistic reasoning features, that the same ideas of like these posterior distributions, how they course in as a result of the profit models. I think there's a lot more work to be done there to actually show that some of these ideas that were like interesting in base 3 can translate to Gen 2.
Tough work.
Is there hope of integrating all the different kinds of scene representations that you've shown across your different projects into the single large one? Because I think each of them have like own very cool features, but like, you know, Gen 3D doesn't have the scene graphs. For example, here's like how you think you're gonna go back to this like super rich 3D modeling.
Yeah. Definitely. I think for the broader group, I think that's like an exciting feature of this approach, is that all of these different research problems that kind of are tackling a different problem produced artifacts that would not be too difficult to compose with one another, because they're all probabilistic programs. They're in the same framework. So to answer your question, like, yes, we're very excited about incorporating all of those components. And I think before we deploy this on a real robot for SLAM and object tracking, we would do exactly.
That's just one of the open session questions. This is a version of Josh's question about Linux LLMs. So, and also the probability, telling you knowledge. So, if you speculate on what a foundation model based on this approach would look like, and also what technical gaps would have to be closed, actually deliver.
I mean, one simple part of this is right now it's like relying on depth image data coming from my camera or LiDARs. But if we want this to be applied on like all of YouTube or to the open world on video just captured on anyone's phone, we need to go beyond that. That's part of it. Second, another thing here is every time we like constructed objects, that was using supervision of like a mask. But ideally, we want systems that you could take a video of a scene and, you know, as I pull objects apart and the system recognizes they're independently movable, can like form those object representations on the floor. Those are two components of what a foundation model using these components would need to be.
If there are no other questions, then let's have the closed session.
Yeah.
Yeah.